Can I remind everyone that this evening's event is being held on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be, and that I extend my respect to elders past and present. Friends, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to John Robertson, the leader of the ALP Parliamentary Party in New South Wales, and his parliamentary shadow ministerial colleague, Mick Veach. I'd also like to thank Mick and his parliamentary colleague Steve Wong on behalf of Herman for their support of the campaign thus far. Before I call upon John to officially open Herman's campaign, I think it's only right that I say a few words about John, given his commitment to both the Labor movement specifically and social justice more broadly over many decades. Ladies and gentlemen, John is a member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, representing Blacktown since 2011. Not only is John parliamentary leader of the ALP, he is also Shadow Minister for Western Sydney and Shadow Minister for the Illawarra. John has held numerous ministerial portfolios, including Minister for Transport, Minister for Industrial Relations, Special Minister of State and Minister for Commerce. Prior to entering the Legislative Assembly, John served as a member of the Legislative Council between 2008 and 2011. Now, at 16 years of age, Robbo, as he's affectionately known, began his apprenticeship as an electrician, working on building sites in Sydney between 1979 until 1986, including Parliament House in Macquarie Street. In 1986, he became an organiser for the Electrical Trade Union in 1991, John became an industrial officer with the Labor Council of New South Wales and then served as its executive officer in 1998. Later that same year, John became the Assistant Secretary of the New South Wales Labor Council. In 2001, John was elected Secretary of Unions New South Wales, where he immediately led the charge against workers' compensation law, so-called reforms. He has been on the Administrative Committee of the Australian Labor Party and became the Vice President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions in 2006. Whilst John has led many campaigns in the pursuit of social justice, his work on refugee rights and his campaign on Your Rights at Work was second to none, which all of us in the Labor movement are deeply indebted. John, can I say, from one former building worker and proud trade unionist to another, I welcome you here in Armidale and thank you for your support of Herman's campaign as we do our bit in the Northern Tablelands in rebuilding and rejuvenating our party. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Robertson, the leader of the New South Wales ALP.
Thanks, Tony. Can I too begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're gathered on and pay my respects to elders both past and present, and also the fact that theirs is one of the longest continuing cultures in the world, and I make that point on a regular basis because I think it is quite significant that it is something that goes unmentioned far too often. Can I also acknowledge my parliamentary colleague Mick Veach and also our candidate in the room, Herman Beyersdorf, and the other distinguished guests who are here. This is an important and significant milestone for Labor in our rebuilding process. I said when I became leader that for far too long we had allowed ourselves not to run in seats that were held by independents or where there were independent candidates running. And for me, as someone who grew up in a Labor household, I think that we did ourselves a massive disservice in rural and regional New South Wales by adopting that position. And I've said from the outset that I was going to fight in the bush as well as in the city to see Labor back in office and back in power in New South Wales for government. Now, I just want to say something very briefly. A bloke once told me that if someone gets up and talks about themselves, they've got nothing to say. So I am going to say a very small bit about myself, but I've got plenty to say as well. I grew up in a Labor household. I handed out my first out of votes at 10. I didn't grow up in a family that was part of a Labor dynasty or anything like that. My father started his working life as a fitter on the railways at Everleigh, worked as a fitter around the place and the like, ran for pre-selection once and came fourth out of 4 candidates for the seat of Parramatta. And that was the extent of, I guess, what my father's role was within the Labor Party. But my father was what I would describe as a political tragedy. So I grew up in a house where we talked politics and we always talked Labor politics. My father, I lived in a cul-de-sac, and my father built with a bloke down the street. There were only 8 houses in that street for the 1969 election. They built in our garage I guess you'd call it like a booth to sit out the front of my local primary school. They painted it and they had sign writing on it. We had a little blue Mini that they had sign writing on, and they were picking up the elderly and the like to come and vote. So that was the sort of household I grew up in, and hence I handed out my first out of votes at the age of 10 in 1972, and just grew up with Labor politics in my blood. And I take the job of leader of the New South Wales Labor Party very seriously. I take it very seriously because it is a huge responsibility. It is a responsibility to re-engage and reinvigorate a party that suffered the most significant defeat in its history. A defeat that many would argue was deserving, and I would say was inevitable, but nonetheless something that we must put behind us. Not the lessons that we should learn from that defeat, but that defeat must be put behind us and we must not dwell on it. Because in New South Wales, we have a lazy government led by Barry O'Farrell and Andrew Stoner. A government that did nothing in opposition to prepare itself for government. An opposition that did nothing and would say, oh, we weren't certain that we were going to win, and they would have been pretty much the only people in New South Wales who would have actually believed that. But a government that came to office and has delivered nothing when it comes to the sorts of things that it promised. And worse, it's implementing policies that are already hurting people in New South Wales, and in particular in the bush. It is a government that is neglecting the bush. It's a government that's talking about rolling out infrastructure projects in Sydney like the North West Rail Link that is just sucking money out of rural New South Wales. They talk about road projects like WestConnex that'll be $10 to $13 billion. Money they don't have, but money that will come from the bush to build projects in the city. And this election, this by-election, is absolutely critical. It's critical, and we are fortunate to have a candidate of the calibre of Herman standing for us here in the Northern Tablelands. When it comes to things like health, we had a man who's been elected as Premier, who spent 4 years as opposition leader highlighting all the problems in the health system, and he spent 2 years doing nothing to fix those problems. In fact, what he's doing to our health system is cutting $3 billion out of the health system. We are seeing beds closed, we are seeing wards closed, none of which was ever mentioned during the election campaign. Coal seam gas. A Premier who was elected saying he was going to ring-fence prime agricultural land, who was going to solve all the problems for anyone who was on the land when it came to coal seam gas. And instead, we see again the complete opposite, unless you happen to live in metropolitan Sydney, or they're going to be drilling for coal seam gas somewhere near your house. What we have is a government that has actually said, well, we can't ring-fence prime agricultural land, it's all too hard, and if people don't make enough noise, then we'll just allow it to proceed. Now, I will say this, that the last Labor government got it wrong when it came to coal seam gas. We were far too busy rushing headlong into it, and one of the early things I did was overturn that policy on coal seam gas. I've said that there should be no coal seam gas exploration or extraction until the science is properly developed. And I arrived at that conclusion on the basis of what I've seen occur elsewhere, where people have told the public over the years that something that they're doing is safe, that there are no health consequences, that there are no environmental consequences. I've sat across the table from these gas companies who are less than happy with our stance, but I've told them that history is too littered with examples of business that told people there was nothing wrong with what they were doing or what they were selling. And there were two obvious examples that I used. The first one is tobacco, where the tobacco industry for years and years and years would tell everyone that smoking does not cause cancer, even when the medical evidence was in. And the second one is asbestos. James Hardy and CSR, when workers were dying, when people were dying of mesothelioma and asbestosis, were saying asbestos is safe, you can sprinkle it on your cornflakes and eat it in your breakfast and it will have no effect, and we know that to be a lie. And what we don't know about coal seam gas is what the full consequences are to our water aquifers, our water catchment and our agricultural land. And until the science is in, we should be pushing pause. Because gas isn't like cheese in the fridge. Gas in the ground isn't going to go off, it will be there. But we need to make sure that we are not compromising on our water. And this is an area where this government has badly let the public down. Another area where, again, nothing was mentioned before the election is hunting in our national parks. An absolute disgrace and travesty when it comes to the protection of our native flora and fauna. These are parks where they have been identified specifically because of their environmental value. And what we end up with is a government that does a dirty, grubby deal with the Shooters and Fishers Party simply to push their legislation through and compromises the safety of the flora and fauna in those national parks, and worse, compromises the safety of people who use our national parks. This government is prepared to sacrifice some of the most sacred areas of our state when it comes to the environment simply to get their legislative agenda through. And I have said an elected Robertson Labor government will overturn that decision and ban hunting in national parks as it should be. The final thing I want to say before I officially launch the campaign is electricity poles and wires privatisation. Now, I've fought poles and wires and electricity privatisation in 1998 and in 2008. And I fought it not because it's an ideological thing for me, because it's the right thing, because it's a Labor thing, that we should never allow the private sector to operate a natural monopoly. We should never allow the private sector to compromise the reliability and affordability of the electricity that every household in this state relies on, every business in this state relies on, and ensuring that it is affordable and it is reliable. This government is starting to posture towards going to the next election to privatise poles and wires. Now, I've said to any journalist that's asked me, bring it on. I'd be more than happy to make the next election about the privatisation of poles and wires. Because if you look at what happened in Victoria, if you look at what happened in South Australia, we saw massive price hikes in power prices once the poles and wires were sold off to the private sector. If you look at the most recent inquiry into those tragic bushfires that occurred in Victoria a few years ago, the coroner is now saying that that fire was started because of poor maintenance of a transmission line that saw a cable drop that arced with the ground and started the fire. And that's what happens when you privatise poles and wires. Yeah. And we should do everything within our power to make sure that we keep pushing this government, that we highlight to people the real risks and the real dangers of power privatisation. Now, people say to me, oh, there's not that much difference between the parties, the major parties these days. I say there are massive differences between Labor and the Conservatives. This is a government that came to office and immediately cut death and disability protections for police. Mentioned nothing about it. A government that has cut workers' compensation benefits to working people in this state. A government that's increased TAFE fees and made it less accessible and is still cutting into TAFE. A government that increased public housing rents for pensioners by 10%, something a Labor government would never have done. And when people say to you, oh, there's no difference or it doesn't matter, they're the sorts of things that you've got to talk about. Because I believe that Labor is and always will be the party of aspiration. It was the basis upon which we were founded. The aspiration for people to achieve and live a better life. The party that stands up and gives those in our community who don't have a voice the opportunity to be heard or the opportunity to have someone advocate on their behalf. Now, along the way, we may have well lost our way at times, but fundamentally, deep down within every one of us, we know what Labor is. I know as leader what Labor is. I know why my job is so important, and it is to go back to those basics of advocating for those that are less able to advocate for themselves. To think about what are the sorts of policies that allow people to actually live the life they want to lead and achieve the goals and aspirations that they've got for themselves and their families. Fundamentally, that's what Labor is about, and that's what Labor under my leadership is about. Contrast that with the coalition, the O'Farrell-Stoner government, that's cut, pushed up energy prices by over 40% in 2 years, pushed up rents for pensioners, and done nothing to fix the problems that they spent 4 years highlighting about. Those are the differences. That's what makes this by-election so important, because we've got a great candidate in Herman, someone who is a local, who's well known within the community, someone who will stand up, someone who shares those values, someone who is going to go out there and take the fight up to the Nationals in this by-election with my support, the support of the Parliamentary wing of the Labor Party, and with your support, we can give it a real crack in Northern Tablelands. So ladies and gentlemen, it is my real pleasure to launch officially the by-election campaign for the seat of the Northern Tablelands for Herman Beyersdorf.
Friends, I didn't know I had so many friends. Thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for coming. I'll start again. Friends, colleagues, comrades, thank you for coming. First of all, my sincere thanks to John Robertson, Leader of the Opposition, Leader of the New South Wales Parliamentary Labor Party, for his kind and indeed encouraging words, and for the support that he and his parliamentary team is giving to my campaign, especially Mick Veith and Steve Wan. And thanks to Mick, who is with us here today, fraternal greetings to you. Now, I'm extremely honoured, as I've just said, by this support, but I'm equally honoured and indeed thrilled or chuffed or whatever by the support I'm getting here, right here, in the Northern Tablelands electorate, from the country Labor branches and from all friends and supporters who are gathered here today, and a number of others, of course, who couldn't make it but who are supporting and who are friends. A special thanks already at this early stage of the campaign, another 3 weeks or 2 weeks and 6 days to go. Special thanks already to all the hard-working members of the campaign team, and especially to my campaign manager, where is he? Tony Ramsey. All the above support certainly makes campaigning a pleasure, most of the time anyway. I'm also pleased by the support I'm receiving from the state Labor MPs and also, well not also, but shadow ministers who will be coming to the electorate in the following 3 weeks, in the ensuing 3 weeks. John, it has been a very long time since the Northern Tablelands has received this level of support during a campaign. It is humbling for me, but I must say it is also essential if we are to rebuild the party in country and regional New South Wales. John, I know you are a very strong supporter of running candidates in country seats, and I would ask that you convey my appreciation to your MPs when you next address them. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a strong believer that there are lessons to be learned from history, from recent history I guess, as we must never again treat our local branches and party membership as afterthoughts to the political process. John, This is the start of the way forward, and we very much appreciate your support and respect. Now, friends, I don't intend to speculate at length on the outcome of this by-election, and I'm also not going to make any comments about any of the other candidates. If you buy me a beer at the bar later, I'll probably give you a few insights perhaps, but not now, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't intend to speculate on the outcome. We'll have to wait until the 25th of May for that. Except I want to say, it's very obvious, to me anyway, that this election is wide open, unusually so. After the resignation, and indeed the disappearance or vanishing, you know who I'm talking about, of the previous incumbent, Richard Torbay, if I mention his name, received 63% or 63.4% of the vote at the 2011 election. And many of these voters, almost 2/3 of the voters in the electorate, many of these voters are undoubtedly deeply disappointed. Indeed, many, I think, feel betrayed by the unfolding of the recent events. No further comment on that. I hope and expect that I, as the Country Labor candidate, will be seen by many of these disaffected voters as a suitable alternative, offering as I can a record of honesty and integrity, along with a proven track record of experience and indeed expertise in serving the community or communities of this region. Without going on too much about myself, just a few more words please. I've served this community for nearly 22 years on council and elsewhere, like the University Council and Regional Development Australia, etc., etc. I know our community, or the different communities in the Northern Tablelands. I know the people and the issues. Like always, the Nationals are taking us, Country Labor, for granted. They expect to win this seat without even bothering to engage with the community in a genuine and meaningful manner. A vote for me is a vote to tell Barry O'Farrell and Andrew Stoner that our community here has been let down and will not be taken for granted. Ladies and gentlemen, Country New South Wales' future must be built on a platform of education. Actions, however, as we know, speak much louder than words, as the O'Farrell government can't claim to support Gonski on the one hand, and Gonski in the top quality education system, when at the same time it's cutting 1.7, almost with million, but it's billion, $1.7 billion from our schools and refusing to stump up its fair share of funding for the reforms. To put these cuts in perspective, every school and every student is being savagely hit with the equivalent of more than 17,000 school teachers. By the way, I'll have to go to Ashford next week, where there's 3 of the central schools who are engaging in a sort of a distance education program from not Wagga Wagga, Dubbo, is being threatened. That's being cut by the O'Farrell government. Right, like education, the O'Farrell government is ripping $3 billion, again billion, from the public health system, which is having a serious impact on patient care. Longer waiting times and delays to life-saving surgery, unclean wards and patients left unattended for hours on end are the consequences of O'Farrell's hospital budget cut. I just signed something at the farmers market this morning with the Nurses Federation having, trying to show their problems to us. Ladies and gentlemen, these cuts are having serious consequences, as I've just implied, to workers' morale, as our already overworked hospital staff are facing an impossible situation. So whether it's Armadale Hospital or other hospitals in the electorate, whether it's forced council amalgamations, and I stress the word forced, whether it's local land services, electricity privatisation, the poles and so on, hunting in national parks, and not to mention, of course, coal seam gas, our community will always be the poorer under the Nationals. Friends, while we must appeal to the disappointed and disaffected independent voter and convince them not to fall once more for the blandishments of the now well and truly tarnished independent brand, we must also ensure that these voters are not wooed back into National Party territory. Be under no illusion, the chief opponent in this by-election is the O'Farrell-Stoner government. We have recently reached, very recently, would have been March 2017, we've recently reached the halfway point, or half-time as an old footballer would say, the halfway point in the Liberal National Government's term of office. And I'm determined, with your assistance, friends, to do my best to expose the record of broken promises of this government that has affected us all, and the damaging cuts to services across the entire public sector in this electorate. By-elections, this is a by-election is coming up, of course. By-elections are traditionally a litmus test of the government's popularity, or should I say here, unpopularity. So let's send a message to the Liberal National Government. We're not happy, Barry. I'll repeat that. We are not happy, Barry. Let us also take this opportunity, and I'm finishing up now, let us also take this opportunity to build a foundation for a re-elected Labor government in 2015 under the progressive leadership of John Robertson. Thank you again for your support.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much, and thank you, John, for your fantastic, enthusiastic speech, and thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen. A big round of applause for Herman and doing a fantastic job. Now we've got some more food platters, quite a lot of food platters coming up, so it's drinks at the bar, food, camaraderie, and a raffle. John, as you know, all ALP functions must have a raffle. And this is not a Chinese restaurant as well. Anyone that normally goes to ALP functions, it's normally a Chinese restaurant. So we're breaking out of the mould there. Herman, well done. It's the new Labor. So please.